Hey everyone, Jack here. Ever wonder what it feels like to fly for a ghost? To have your wings painted on a lie while you hauled cargo that didn't officially exist to a place that wasn't on any public map? Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a job where the most important parts of the contract were written in invisible ink. The heat in Udon hit me first. It wasn't just heat, it was a physical presence. A wet, heavy blanket reeking of diesel fumes, charcoal smoke, and something sweet and cloying that I later learned was frangipani. It was 1968, and I'd left the crisp, predictable skies of an Air Force base in California for this. The recruiter in a smoke-filled room in San Francisco had been vague, promising interesting flying and pay that made my captain's salary look like pocket money. He mentioned a company called Air America. Sounded legitimate enough, like some regional puddle jumper. He didn't mention Laos, the CIA, or the fact that my life expectancy would soon be measured in flight hours rather than years. My taxi, a battered Toyota with a dashboard full of dangling amulets, rattled its way through the chaotic streets of Udon Thani, Thailand, and deposited me in front of a nondescript hotel. The instructions were simple: check in, wait for a call. For 2 days, I did just that, nursing warm Singa beers by a lethargic ceiling fan, my sense of purpose draining away with the sweat beading on my forehead. The call finally came. A flat American voice told me to be at a place called the Purple Porpoise at 20 Gauss hours. The bar was exactly what you'd expect. A dimly lit dive filled with loud, sunburnt Americans in civilian clothes who carried themselves with a military stiffness they couldn't quite shake. They were pilots, I could tell. They had that look in their eyes, a mixture of profound boredom and hypervigilance, the look of men who spend their days cheating death and their nights trying to forget it. A man detached himself from the shadows. He was older, with a leathery tan and eyes that seemed to have seen the curvature of the earth from every conceivable angle. He introduced himself only as Dutch. He didn't offer a handshake. Riley, he grunted, gesturing to a sticky table. Buy you a beer? Over the next hour, he conducted the strangest job interview of my life. He didn't ask about my flight record or my service history. He already knew all that. Instead, he asked what I thought of the war in Vietnam. He asked if I was married, if I had kids, if I had debts. He asked if I was the kind of man who needed to file a flight plan. Let me be clear, kid, he said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We're a commercial airline. We fly rice to refugees, medicine to the sick, supplies to development projects. We're humanitarians. He paused, taking a long drag from a cigarette. But sometimes the landing zones are a little unmanicured. Sometimes the refugees shoot back, and sometimes the cargo is more important than the pilot. We don't fly for a flag. We don't get medals. We get paid. And if we're lucky, we get old. You follow the manifest, you fly the route, and you don't ask questions, especially about who signs the checks. Can you do that? The air was thick with unspoken truths. I knew right then that commercial airline was a punchline. This was something else entirely. This was the shadow war you heard whispers about, the one that wasn't on the evening news. Every instinct I'd honed in the structured world of the USAF screamed at me to walk away. But there was something else too. A pull. The promise of flying stripped down to its rawest, most essential form. No parades, no politics, just a machine, a man, and the sky. The kind of flying that separated the talkers from the doers. I looked at Dutch, at the hard lines etched around his eyes, and saw a reflection of the restlessness that had driven me here. "When do I start?" I asked. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You already have. Be at the south gate of the airbase at 500. Don't be late. The planes don't wait." That night, sleep was a stranger. The whine of the ceiling fan sounded like a distant propeller, a prelude to a world where the maps were blank, and the only thing you could trust was the machine beneath you and the man in the next seat. I was about to become a pilot for Air America, the CIA's very own airline, a ghost with wings. The pre-dawn air at Udon Royal Thai Air Force Base was cool, a temporary mercy before the sun began its daily assault. The south side of the field was a world away from the gleaming phantoms and thunder chiefs of the USAF. Here, there was no spit and polish, no marching formations. There was just a collection of aircraft that looked like they'd been pulled from a museum of aviation oddities, all painted a bland, civilian-looking grey or white, with no national insignia, no markings at all except for a simple tail number. There were hulking C-123 providers, their twin radial engines glinting in the early light, looking like pregnant whales. There were rugged C-47s, the legendary Goonie birds that had been flying since World War II. And then there were the smaller, stranger birds, the Pilatus PC-6 Porters and Helio Couriers, single-engine aircraft designed for impossibly short takeoffs and landings. They looked like dragonflies, all wings and spindly landing gear, built to dance on the edge of disaster. Dutch was waiting for me, leaning against the fuselage of a Porter, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. "Morning, sunshine," he grunted. "Meet your new girlfriend." He patted the Porter's metal skin. "She's ugly, she's loud, but she'll get you in and out of places you got no business being. Today you're my co-pilot." The cockpit was Spartan, purely functional. The goal wasn't comfort, it was performance. My checkout ride wasn't a gentle flight around the pattern. Dutch took us up, then pointed the nose toward the hazy green hills to the east. "That's Laos," he said, his voice flat over the headset. "Everything you see from here on out, it's not officially happening. We're not here. You got it?" We crossed an invisible line and the world changed. The neat grid of Thai rice paddies gave way to a chaotic, endless sea of jungle-choked limestone casts that jutted up from the earth like broken teeth. There were no roads, no towns, just that suffocating green. Dutch handled the Porter with a casual intimacy like it was an extension of his own body. He pointed out landmarks that weren't on any map. "That's the Plaine des Jars," he said, gesturing to a vast, scarred plateau. PDJ for short. The Pathet Lao and the NVA own most of it. We own the sky above it. Sometimes. Our destination was a place he called Lima Site 36. The Lima sites were the lifeblood of the secret war. Dirt strips, often just a few hundred feet long, hacked out of the jungle or perched precariously on a mountaintop. They were the delivery points for everything. Rice, ammunition, pigs, spies, soldiers. As we approached, Dutch pointed to a ridge. "See that?" I saw nothing but trees. He banked sharply, dropping us into a valley I hadn't even realized was there. Suddenly, a strip of red dirt appeared, carved into the side of a hill. It wasn't just short. It was sloped dramatically uphill. "We only land one way and take off one way here," Dutch said calmly. "Don't want to overshoot and become a permanent part of the scenery." He pushed the throttle forward, then pulled it back, working the stick and rudders in a symphony of practiced motion. The plane felt like it was hanging in the air, barely moving, the stall warning horn blaring its electronic complaint. We hit the dirt strip with a bone-jarring thud, rolling uphill and stopping in a distance that seemed physically impossible. The moment we stopped, the plane was surrounded by small, wiry men in mismatched uniforms. their faces weathered and ancient. They were Hmong, the mountain people who formed the backbone of the CIA's secret army in Laos. They moved with a silent, ferocious efficiency, unloading the sacks of rice from our cargo bay. A tall American with a pale face and civilian clothes, a customer, as the pilots called the CIA case officers, strode over, clipboard in hand. He exchanged a few words with Dutch, all business, then melted back into the group of Hmong. The whole stop took less than 5 minutes. "All right," Dutch said. "Time to go." He taxied to the top of the steep runway. The takeoff was even more terrifying than the landing. He held the brakes, pushed the engine to full power until the entire airframe vibrated with protest, then released. We shot down the slope, fell off the edge of the cliff, and for a heart-stopping second, we were just a rock. Then the wings bit into the air, and we clawed our way back into the sky. On the way back to Udon, we flew in silence for a long time. I was processing what I'd just seen: a clandestine airfield, a private army, a war being fought completely off the books. "That was a milk run," Dutch finally said, reading my mind. "Just rice. Gets more interesting when the cargo is ammo and the guys on the ground are shooting at you." He looked over at me, his gaze steady. "Still think you want this job?" I thought of the sterile predictability of the Air Force, the endless paperwork, the chain of command. Then I thought of that impossible landing, the raw skill it required, the feeling of falling off that cliff and willing the plane back into the air. This was flying on a knife's edge. It was dangerous, it was morally grey, and it was utterly, terrifyingly alive. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "I still want the job." My first solo flight was to a place called Long Tieng. If Udon was the logistical hub, Long Tieng was the heart of the secret war. Codenamed Lima Site 20A, it was a valley hidden deep in the mountains of northern Laos, a place so secret it was referred to only as the most secret place on Earth. It didn't appear on any map, but for a time it was one of the busiest airports in the world. Flying in was a rite of passage. The approach was notoriously difficult. A one-way in, one-way out affair through a narrow gap in the casts, with a sharp dogleg turn just before touchdown. Get it wrong, and you'd smear yourself across a limestone cliff face. The valley itself was a spectacle of organized chaos. The runway was packed with Air America planes of every description: Porters, Helio Couriers, C-47s, C-123s, and even massive C-130s, all landing, taking off, and taxiing in a seemingly suicidal ballet. The perimeter was ringed with Hmong soldiers, their families living in a sprawling shantytown that clung to the hillsides. In the center of it all was the command post of General Vang Pao, the charismatic and ruthless leader of the CIA's clandestine army. And sprinkled throughout were the customers, the CIA case officers dressed in chinos and short-sleeved shirts, looking utterly out of place yet clearly in charge. My cargo that day was medical supplies and several hundred live chickens, their clucking a constant maddening chorus over the drone of the engine. As I descended into the valley, my hands slick with sweat, I could hear the constant radio chatter, a mix of pilot slang, laconic instructions, and clipped warnings. "Watch out for the afternoon build-up over Skyline," one voice crackled. "Lima Site 85 is taking ground fire. All traffic divert." It was a private language for a private war. After I landed and the chickens were unloaded by a swarm of Hmong women and children, I was told to report to the Air America Shack, a long wooden building that served as the pilot's lounge, operations center, and unofficial bar. The place was a riot of noise and smells: stale beer, cigarette smoke, and nervous energy. Pilots fresh from a mission would stride in, grab a cold one, and start recounting their latest brush with death, their voices loud and brittle with adrenaline. One pilot was describing having to land a damaged porter on one wheel. Another was complaining about a CIA case officer who wanted him to land in a rice paddy that was still occupied by the Pathet Lao. It was here that I first understood the culture. These men were cowboys of the sky, mercenaries of a sort, but they were also some of the finest pilots I had ever seen. They had to be. The margins for error here were zero. They flew overloaded planes into impossible airstrips, often with no navigational aids in weather that would ground any sane aviator. They were sustained by a mixture of skill, fatalism, and the obscene amounts of money they were making. That evening, I sat at the bar next to a grizzled veteran named Earthquake Magoon, a legendary C-47 pilot who'd been flying in Asia since the Flying Tigers. He was a mountain of a man with a booming laugh. He saw me nursing my beer and clapped me on the back, nearly sending me through the floor. "First time in the valley, kid," he roared. "Don't worry, you never forget your first. Or your last." He told me stories of flying for CATI, Civil Air Transport, the precursor to Air America, dropping supplies to the French at Dien Bien Phu. He spoke of the war not in terms of politics or ideology, but in terms of cargo, weather, and landing strips. It was a job, the most dangerous job in the world, but a job nonetheless. As darkness fell over Longtieng, the valley transformed. The roar of engines was replaced by the chirping of insects and the distant sound of Hmong music. But it was a deceptive peace. From the surrounding ridges, you could sometimes see the flash of artillery, a constant reminder that this secret city was an island in a sea of war. Sitting there, I realized Air America wasn't just an airline. It was a self-contained universe with its own laws, its own language, its own morality. We were ghosts, flying ghost planes into a ghost city, fighting a ghost war. The paychecks were real. The danger was real, and the men who died were real. But to the outside world, none of it existed. We were a line item in a black budget, a convenient fiction. That night, I truly became one of them. I learned to stop asking why and started focusing on how. How to land on a slick, rain-soaked strip. How to find a tiny village hidden in 1,000,000 square miles of jungle. How to fly straight and level while your gut was screaming in terror. How to stay alive. The routine, if you could call it that, settled in with a terrifying normality. My logbook filled with cryptic entries. LS-28 to LS-11, LS-32 to LS-85. Rice, pigs, ammo, repeat. The Lima sites were my world, each one a unique challenge. Some were relatively safe milk runs in friendly territory. Others were hot, nestled deep in areas controlled by the Pathet Lao and their North Vietnamese allies. Flying into a hot LZ was a full-body experience. You'd come in low, hugging the terrain to stay under their radar, if they even had any. More often, you were trying to avoid the eyes of some kid with an AK-47 on a hillside. The approach was always fast and steep. No leisurely descents. You'd pop up over a ridge, dive at the strip, and get on the ground as quickly as possible. The moment your wheels touched dirt, the real race began. Your kicker, the crewman in the back, would shove the cargo out the open door, often while the plane was still rolling. There was no time to shut down the engine. You were a target. The air would be filled with a sound like popcorn, a strangely domestic noise until you realized it was small arms fire. Sometimes you'd hear a louder thump, which meant a piece of your airplane had just been hit. The rule was simple. Stay on the ground for no more than 30 seconds. Kick the cargo, maybe pull a few wounded Hmong soldiers aboard and get the hell out. takeoffs were a controlled crash in the opposite direction. Full power, a short, violent run, and claw for altitude, jinking and weaving to present a more difficult target. On those flights, the cockpit was a bubble of intense concentration. Your entire world shrank to the instruments, the feel of the stick, and the voice of your kicker in the headset yelling, "Clear," or taking fire from the left. Only when you were miles away, feet wet over a river or hidden by a karst ridge, did the adrenaline begin to recede, leaving behind a shaky exhaustion and the metallic taste of fear. The pilots developed their own coping mechanisms. Some became devout, muttering prayers on every final approach. Others, like Dutch, became reservoirs of gallows humor. I remember one mission where we were flying a C-123 Provider, a much larger beast than the Porter, into a valley that was known to have anti-aircraft guns. As we descended, the sky around us was pocked with little black puffs of smoke from the 37mm cannons. "Well, kid," Dutch said over the intercom, his voice utterly calm as he weaved the big transport plane through the flak. "Looks like the welcoming committee is in a festive mood today. Try not to spill your coffee." The men we supported, the Hmong, were a source of constant awe. I'd land on some remote peak, barely a clearing, and be met by soldiers who looked like teenagers, armed with M16s and ancient carbines. They fought with a quiet, desperate ferocity. We were their lifeline. We brought them the rice that fed their families and the bullets that kept the enemy at bay. In return, they fought and died in a war that wasn't really theirs. A proxy conflict between superpowers played out in their beautiful, brutal homeland. It was this relationship that began to trouble me. We were helping them, yes. But we were also perpetuating the conflict, turning their home into a battlefield. The lines were blurry. One day, the cargo manifest would list humanitarian aid. The next, it would be crates of 105 mm howitzer shells. Were we saviors or merchants of death? The CIA customers did little to clarify things. They were a breed apart. Young, college-educated, they moved through this world of mud and blood with a detached, analytical air. They directed the war from radios in bamboo huts, treating the Hmong soldiers as chess pieces. They were polite, professional, and lived in a different moral universe. To them, it was the game. To the Hmong, it was survival. To us pilots, it was a high-stakes job where your luck could run out at any moment. And it often did. Every few weeks, a plane would go missing. The radio would fall silent. A search would be launched, often finding nothing but a blackened scar on a mountainside. We'd gather at the bar in Udon or Longtieng, raise a glass to the empty chair, tell a few stories, and then go fly the next day's mission. There was no other choice. To stop was to think, and to think too much about the odds, about the why of it all, was a luxury no one could afford. We lived in the moment, in the visceral thrill and terror of the next takeoff, the next landing. The war ground on, and so did we, its unwitting, well-paid ferrymen. The moral calculus of our existence in Laos grew murkier with each flight. It was an open secret, a thing we pilots talked about in hushed tones at the bar after too many drinks, but rarely acknowledged in the light of day. The opium. The Hmong had cultivated poppies in the highlands of Laos for generations. It was a part of their culture and their economy. When the war came, their traditional trade routes were disrupted. But the war also provided a new, incredibly efficient means of transport and a powerful new customer base. The CIA's strategy in Laos was to support General Vang Pao's army to fight the Pathet Lao and the North Vietnamese. This support cost money, far more than was being officially allocated. Vang Pao funded his troops, in part, through a tax on the region's opium harvest. and our airline, Air America, became the de facto transport system. I remember the first time I was explicitly involved. The manifest was cryptic, as usual. Special cargo, it read. The flight was from a collection of lemur sites in the highlands to Vang Pao's headquarters at Long Tieng. At the first stop, instead of rice sacks or ammo crates, Hmong farmers loaded heavy cloth-wrapped bricks onto my porter. They had a distinct, sweet, and sickly smell. No one said a word. The Hmong loaders had blank faces. The local CIA customer who oversaw the loading just nodded curtly and told me to be on my way. He didn't have to say what it was. I knew. It was raw opium. As I flew, the smell filled the small cockpit, a cloying perfume of complicity. I was a drug runner, a US government-sanctioned, paid-in-full drug runner. The irony was suffocating. Back in the world, President Nixon was declaring a war on drugs, while here, in this secret corner of the world, his own intelligence agency was facilitating the key ingredients production and transport to fund a war he denied was even happening. The hypocrisy was staggering. I brought it up with Dutch that night. I found him cleaning a pistol at a table in his hooch, a small, neat bungalow provided by the company. Flew some of Vang Pao's cash crop today, I said, trying to sound casual. Dutch didn't look up from his work. And, he said, it pays the bills, kid. Vang Pao's bills. He uses that stuff to pay his soldiers. The soldiers we need to keep the NVA from rolling right over this whole country and into Thailand. It's a closed system. You want to fight a war on the cheap? This is what it looks like. But it's opium, I protested. This stuff ends up as heroin on the streets somewhere. He finally looked up, his eyes hard. And the bombs we drop end up as dead civilians. The ammo we fly ends up in dead soldiers on both sides. Don't get selective with your morality, Riley. It's a messy business. We're not priests. We're truck drivers. You fly what's on the manifest. If it's rice, you fly rice. If it's lead, you fly lead. If it's Vang Pao's poppy tax, you fly that too. You start trying to draw lines in the sand out here, you'll go crazy. His logic was cold, brutal, and in the twisted context of the secret war, it made a perverse kind of sense. We were cogs in a machine we couldn't see, let alone control. My job was to fly the airplane from point A to point B safely. The nature of the cargo was, as Dutch put it, above my pay grade. So I learned to compartmentalize. I flew the missions. I transported the special cargo when it appeared on my manifest. I watched the bricks being loaded, smelled that sweet, damning scent, and forced myself to think only of airspeed, altitude, and the next ridgeline. But the knowledge festered. It changed the way I saw the war. It was no longer a simple, if secret struggle against communism. It was a knot of compromises, a dirty alliance fueled by desperation and drugs. We were propping up a narco-state to fight our battles for us. The idealism I might have once had was burning away like morning fog over the jungle, replaced by a hard, cynical shell. The missions continued, each one blurring into the next. One day I'd be evacuating a missionary family from a village about to be overrun, feeling like a hero. The next, I'd be hauling opium, feeling like a criminal. It was a dizzying, disorienting existence. We were living a contradiction, fighting for one kind of freedom while enabling another kind of bondage. And every day we flew deeper into the moral haze, the drone of the engine a constant accompaniment to the quiet erosion of our own souls. The bond between the pilots was forged in shared risk and unspoken understanding. We were a brotherhood of circumstance, a dysfunctional family of adrenaline junkies, patriots, and mercenaries. We worked hard, flew hard, and played hard. The nights in Udon or at the Long Tieng bar were a pressure valve, a frantic attempt to burn off the tension of the day. The stories were always an octave too loud, the laughter a little too forced. We drank to forget the close calls, the friends who weren't there anymore, and the faces of the wounded Hmong soldiers we'd pulled out of some firefight. One of those friends was a young pilot named Dave "Preacher" Jensen. He was a quiet, clean-living kid from Iowa who didn't drink or smoke and was saving every penny to buy a farm back home. He got the nickname Preacher because he was always talking about his fiancée and the white picket fence he was going to build. He was a damn good pilot, smooth and careful, not a hotshot. He flew a Helio Courier, a delicate, high-winged aircraft perfect for getting into the tightest, most dangerous strips. We were flying a 2-ship mission to resupply a mountain outpost called Boam Long, a fortress that was perpetually under siege. I was in my Porter, he was in his Courier. The weather was marginal, with low clouds clinging to the ridges, typical for the monsoon season. The mission was straightforward: drop ammo and get out fast. I went in first. The landing was hairy, the dirt strips slick with rain. As my kicker shoved the last crate out, I could hear the pop, pop, pop of rifle fire from the trees beyond the perimeter. I didn't wait. I firewalled the throttle and clawed my way back into the soupy grey sky, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Riley is out," I called over the radio. "Your turn, Preacher. Be advised, they're awake down there." "Roger that," came his calm reply. "See you for a beer tonight." I circled overhead, hidden in the clouds, listening. Standard procedure was to provide cover and a radio relay if needed. I heard him call his final approach. Then, silence. Not a static-filled silence, but a dead, absolute void where his voice should have been. "Preacher, what's your status?" I called. Nothing. "Preacher, this is Riley. Do you copy?" The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight in the cockpit. I broke protocol and descended, popping out of the clouds just long enough to get a look at the valley. What I saw turned my blood to ice. A plume of thick black smoke was rising from the jungle about half a mile short of the runway. It wasn't a crash site. It was an inferno. He'd been hit on a final approach. A lucky shot, an RPG, a heavy machine gun. It didn't matter. He never had a chance. The flight back to Longtieng was the longest of my life. The radio chatter continued around me, pilots coordinating other missions, ground control giving landing instructions, but it all sounded like it was coming from another planet. My world had shrunk to the horrifying image of that black smoke. That night, the bar was quiet. Preacher's empty seat was a black hole in the room. We didn't talk about it much. We didn't need to. We just drank. Dutch sat beside me, staring into his whiskey. "It's the quiet ones who get it sometimes," he said softly, not looking at me. "The guys who think if they fly by the book, they'll be safe. There are no books out here, kid. Just luck. And his ran out today." The loss of Preacher changed something for me. The danger, which had been a thrilling, abstract concept, became personal and deeply real. It could happen to anyone at any time, for no reason at all. It wasn't about skill or caution. It was about a random bullet finding its mark. After that, I started noticing the little rituals of the other pilots, the lucky charms they hung in their cockpits, the way some of them would touch a specific part of the fuselage before climbing in. Superstitions born of a desperate need for some illusion of control in a world that had none. I flew with a new kind of intensity, a cold, focused anger. I took more risks, flew in worse weather, volunteered for the missions no one else wanted. I don't know if I was trying to prove something, or if I was just trying to feel something other than the hollow ache of grief and fear. I was becoming one of the ghosts I flew with, haunted by the quiet kid from Iowa who just wanted to go home and build a fence. The war had taken him, and a piece of all of us went down with him in that fiery crash. The apex of the secret war for me was the siege of Lima Site 85. Pho Pha Thi was a sacred mountain to the Hmong, a towering karst formation that stabbed 5,600 feet into the sky, its peak often shrouded in clouds. Because of its height and its location just a dozen miles from the North Vietnamese border, the USAF and CIA had placed a top-secret tactical air navigation, TACAN station, and a radar installation there. It was codenamed Heavy Green, and it guided American bombers on their runs to Hanoi. It was arguably the most critical piece of intelligence hardware in the entire theater, and it was defended by a handful of USAF technicians who weren't officially there, and a few hundred Hmong and Thai mercenaries. To the North Vietnamese, it was an intolerable provocation. In early 1968, they decided to eliminate it. The first sign of trouble was an increase in enemy activity in the surrounding valleys. Our missions to LS-85, once routine supply drops, became increasingly perilous. We started taking heavy fire on approach. One of our C-123s was shot down trying to bring in a new generator. The CIA customers at Long Tien grew tense, their usual cool demeanor cracking under the pressure. The flights to LS-85 became a lifeline. We flew in everything they needed to hold out: ammunition, sandbags, concertina wire, and food. The strip was a nightmare. A short, sloping patch of dirt clinging to the side of the mountain just below the summit. To land, you had to fly directly at the face of the cliff and then make a hard, last-second turn into the wind. In bad weather, which was most of the time, it was like flying into a glass of milk. I flew a mission in a Porter, loaded with mortar rounds. The clouds were so thick I had to navigate purely by instruments and guesswork, counting down the seconds from a known landmark until I estimated I was near the mountain. I broke out of the clouds just a few hundred feet from the cliff face, the jagged rock filling my entire windscreen. I banked so hard the wings groaned in protest, dropped the flaps, and slammed the plane onto the strip. The Hmong defenders swarmed the aircraft, their faces grim, unloading the cargo with frantic speed. You could hear the constant crackle of gunfire and the crump of incoming mortars from the other side of the ridge. The air smelled of cordite and fear. The USAF technician who signed my manifest was a young sergeant, his face pale and smudged with dirt. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We're running low on everything." I didn't stay a second longer than necessary. The takeoff was a leap of faith, diving off the side of the mountain back into the clouds, praying I wouldn't hit an unseen peak. For weeks, this was the reality. Air America pilots became the sole link between LS-85 and the outside world. We flew around the clock, pushing ourselves and our aircraft to the absolute limit. We lost another plane, a C-47, that strayed too close to an anti-aircraft battery. The crew was never recovered. The end came in March. The North Vietnamese launched a full-scale assault with elite sappers scaling the sheer cliffs at night. The fighting on the summit was brutal, hand-to-hand combat in the fog and darkness. A frantic call came over the radio. "We're being overrun. Evacuate. Evacuate." But it was too late. The weather had socked in completely. No plane could get in or out. We were grounded in Long Tien, listening helplessly to the fragmented, desperate radio calls from the men on the mountain as they were systematically wiped out. The final transmission was from the CIA case officer on site. "They're in the compound. Tell my family I love them." Then silence. The next morning, after the weather cleared, the Air Force bombed its own facility, destroying the secret equipment to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. LS-85 ceased to exist. The loss of Pho Pha Thi was a devastating blow, not just militarily, but psychologically. It proved that no place, no matter how well fortified or secret, was safe. It was a brutal reminder of our own vulnerability. We, the pilots, had done everything we could. We had flown through hell to keep those men supplied, but in the end, it wasn't enough. The mountain had reclaimed its secrets and buried our friends along with them. The days after the fall of LS-85 were somber. A new, harder cynicism took hold. We had risked our lives for a piece of rock that was now gone, for men who were now ghosts. The why of it all became an even more dangerous question to ask. So we didn't. We just fueled up the planes and flew the next day's schedule, our faces set like stone, the silent ghosts of Limousin 85 flying on our wings. By the early 1970s, the winds of political change blowing from Washington began to be felt even in our secret corner of the world. The Paris Peace Accords were being negotiated. The word Vietnamization was on everyone's lips. For the official war in Vietnam, it meant a slow, drawn-out withdrawal. For our secret war in Laos, it meant the beginning of the end. The money started to dry up. The missions became fewer. The massive fleet of Air America planes began to shrink. We were a clandestine operation, and with the American public weary of war, clandestine operations were becoming a political liability. There was a palpable sense of abandonment in the air. For years, we had been the lifeline for the Hmong. We had made them a promise, albeit an unspoken one. Fight for us, and we will support you. Now that promise was being broken. Vang Pao would stalk around Long Tieng, his face a thundercloud, holding tense meetings with the ever-dwindling number of CIA customers. The Hmong soldiers, who had fought and bled for a decade, looked at us with a new expression in their eyes. It wasn't hatred. It was a kind of bewildered betrayal. They had tied their fate to ours, and we were about to cut the rope. The flying changed too. The missions were less about offensive support and more about consolidation and eventually retreat. We were pulling people out of remote outposts that were about to be swallowed by the advancing Pathet Lao and NVA. These weren't tactical retreats. They were evacuations. The mood in the cockpit was grim. We were no longer supplying a war. We were managing its decline. I remember flying into a small village high on a plateau. For years, we had brought them rice and weapons. Now my orders were to evacuate the village chief and his family. The entire village came out to the dirt strip to see him off. As he climbed into my porter, an old woman grabbed my arm, her eyes pleading. She spoke no English, and I spoke no Hmong, but her meaning was terrifyingly clear. What about us? I had no answer. I was just the bus driver. I pulled her hand away gently, closed the door, and took off, leaving 100 people on a dusty airstrip to face the enemy alone. The image of their faces, watching my plane shrink into the distance, has never left me. It felt like a profound and personal failure. The humor at the bar soured, turning black and bitter. The bravado was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. We were watching the world we had helped build crumble around us. Many pilots, seeing the writing on the wall, simply quit. They took their fat paychecks and disappeared back to the world, trying to erase the last few years from their memory. But some of us stayed. Dutch stayed. I stayed. I don't know if it was loyalty, inertia, or a misplaced sense of duty. We had been there for the build-up. We felt we had to be there for the collapse. The job now was to save who we could. The official term was exfiltration. We called it the Great Bug Out. We flew overloaded C-47s and C-123s, packing them with Hmong soldiers, their families, and anyone who had worked closely with the Americans. The rules went out the window. Weight and balance calculations were a joke. We crammed people in until there was no room to move. a cargo of terrified, displaced humanity. They carried whatever they could: a sack of rice, a family heirloom, a child's toy. Most carried nothing but the clothes on their backs and the fear in their eyes. The flights were tense and sorrowful. The usual boisterous chatter of Hmong soldiers was replaced by a stunned silence. They were leaving the mountains that had been their home for centuries, flying into an unknown future in refugee camps in Thailand. We were their Charon, ferrying them across the river Styx, from a home that was no longer home to an exile they had never imagined. During this time, I rarely flew into Long Tieng. The place was a powder keg of fear and anger, but the news that trickled out was bleak. The Pathet Lao were closing in. The end was not a matter of if, but when. We were just buying time, saving a few hundred people while tens of thousands were being left behind. We had been gods in the sky to these people, capable of delivering anything from pigs to howitzers. Now we were just men in airplanes, powerless to stop the tide of history that we ourselves had set in motion. The final day of Long Tieng was May 14, 1975. The Pathet Lao were on the ridges overlooking the valley. Artillery shells were beginning to fall on the runway. The official order had come down from the remnants of the CIA station. All American personnel were to evacuate immediately. The war was over. We had lost. I was in Udon, scheduled for a C-47 flight to Bangkok, a non-essential flight far from the action. But none of us could turn away. The radio in the operations shack was tuned to the Long Tieng frequency, and we listened, helpless, as the final act of the tragedy unfolded. Dutch was one of the last pilots in the valley. His voice, usually so calm and laced with irony, was tight with strain. He was flying a C-47, trying to get one last load of Hmong out. "The runway is mobbed," he crackled over the radio. "There are thousands of them. They're climbing on the wings. I can't taxi." We could hear the panic in the background, the roar of a crowd, the sounds of shouting. Another pilot, in a Huey helicopter, was trying to rescue General Vang Pao from the roof of his command center. The scene being described over the radio was one of absolute chaos and despair. The people we had armed and trained, the people who had trusted us, were now clinging to the wings and landing gear of the last planes out, begging for a salvation that wasn't coming. I couldn't just sit there. It felt fundamentally wrong. I found my kicker, a wiry ex-Marine named Sal, and told him we were going. He just nodded. We didn't have orders. We didn't have a manifest. We sprinted to a Pilatus Porter that was fueled and ready on the flight line. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Riley?" the station chief yelled as we climbed in. "There are no more flights to 20A. It's over." I didn't answer him. I just started the engine. "You're on your own," he shouted over the propeller wash. "The company will not cover you." Flying into Long Tieng that last time was like flying into a vision of hell. The sky was black with smoke. Artillery was impacting all around the valley. The runway, once a model of chaotic efficiency, was a seething mass of humanity. Landing was impossible. I saw Dutch's C-47 finally managing to break free from the crowd, lumber into the air, dangerously overloaded. I knew what I had to do. There was a small secondary dirt strip on the other side of the valley, used for Vang Pao's personal airspeed-like light aircraft. It was too short for most planes, but maybe, just maybe, a porter could handle it. I put the plane down hard, stood on the brakes, and prayed. We rolled to a stop just feet from the end of the strip. I didn't even shut down the engine. I just turned to Sal. "Get who you can." He threw open the door. We were immediately mobbed, but these weren't the panicked crowds at the main runway. This was a smaller group, a family I recognized. It was the family of a Hmong commander I'd worked with, a man named Chu. He had been killed a month earlier. I had promised him I would look after his family if the worst happened. Now the worst was here. Sal was a force of nature, pulling Chu's wife and their 5 children into the small plane, shoving, shouting, creating a pocket of order in the chaos. I looked out the cockpit window and saw thousands more running toward us from the main town. We had seconds. "That's it! We're full!" Sal yelled, slamming the door. The plane was dangerously overweight. I pushed the throttle to the firewall. The porter struggled, groaning under the load. We used every inch of that tiny strip. As we lifted off, I could see the first Pathet Lao soldiers entering the edge of the town. We cleared the ridge by what felt like inches. Below us, Long Tieng was being consumed. I didn't look back. The flight to Thailand was silent. Cho's family huddled in the back, their faces numb with shock and grief. Sal just stared out the window. I flew on autopilot, my mind a blank. We had saved 6 people. We had left behind 40,000. It didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like anything. When we landed back at Udon, the Air America section of the base was already being dismantled. The ghosts were packing their bags, preparing to vanish as if they had never been there. The secret was being put back in its box. My unsanctioned flight earned me a quiet, unceremonious dismissal. I was paid out and told my services were no longer required. It was over, just like that. I've been back in the world for a long time now. The life I lead is quiet, predictable. I fly for a commercial cargo company, hauling electronics and machine parts across the United States. I file flight plans. I follow regulations. The skies are orderly, the landing strips are paved, and no one is shooting at me. It's a good life, a safe life. But some nights, when the air is still and the only sound is the hum of the refrigerator, I can still hear the drone of a single-engine Porter. I can feel the lurch in my stomach as it drops off a cliffside runway in Laos. I can smell the jungle after a monsoon rain, mixed with the scent of cordite and fear. Air America officially ceased to exist in 1976. Its assets were sold off, its records classified or destroyed. The ghost airline vanished. To the world, it was just a footnote, a bizarre rumor from a war everyone wanted to forget. But for those of us who were there, it's a part of our DNA. The experience branded us. How do you explain a life like that to someone who wasn't there? How do you describe the feeling of landing on a mountain peak in the clouds? The camaraderie of men who faced death with a joke? The moral vertigo of being both a humanitarian and a warrior, a savior and a smuggler? I see Dutch sometimes. He lives a few hours down the coast. We're old men now. We sit on his porch, drink beer, and watch the ocean. We don't talk about the old days much. We don't need to. We just sit in a comfortable silence. 2 former ghosts who know they share a past that is invisible to everyone around them. He survived. I survived. We were the lucky ones. So many others, Preacher, Earthquake Magoon, the technicians at LS-85, and countless Hmong soldiers were consumed by that secret war. They became real ghosts. Sometimes I think about the contract I signed, the one written in invisible ink. The official contract was for a salary, for flight hours. But the real contract was an exchange. I gave them my youth, my skills, and a piece of my soul. In return, they gave me a lifetime of memories so vivid and intense that everything since has felt like it's in black and white. They gave me the chance to fly on the absolute edge of skill and sanity, to see the world from a perspective few will ever know. And they gave me the burden of that knowledge. The knowledge of what was done in the name of a secret. the promises that were made, and the promises that were broken. I think of Cho's family. I heard they were eventually resettled in Minnesota. I hope they found peace. I hope their children grew up to have lives free from the ghosts of war. They are a tangible piece of my past, a reminder that amidst all the cynicism and chaos, there were moments of grace, moments where we made a small difference. I was a pilot for an airline that didn't exist, in a war that didn't happen, for a cause that was hopelessly compromised. It was a lie wrapped in a riddle, flown by men who learned to live without answers. But the sky was real, the danger was real, and the bonds we forged in that crucible of fire and air were the most real things of all. We were Air America,